What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're about to have your mind blown. We're going to talk about, queer theology, embodiment, sexuality, and what the church needs to learn, gain with the one and the only Dr. Reverend J.E. Johnson from the Pacific School of Religion. The Graduate Theological Union is the big conglomeration in Berkeley, California, of all those divinity schools that Jay's a part of. And you'll recognize his voice because he was an epic, a legend on the live podcast from GTU not that long ago. But today, we're going to talk about gender, sexuality, queer theology, communion, Eucharistic theology, sexual intimacy, embodiment, dance parties, and more. We end up touching on topics that are in two of his most recent books. One is The Divine Communion, a Eucharistic theology of sexual intimacy, and Peculiar Faith, queer theology for Christian witness. We have an amazing conversation that I'm sure you are going to enjoy. You know, if you like nerdy theological conversations that blow your mind and open up all new avenues, maybe that's better. Or it could open up Oreos if in the cream of an Oreo was theological ingredients. If you wanted to maybe use that and brew like a double stuffed Oreo chocolate porter, metaphorically as a theology, maybe then that's what's about to happen. Nonetheless, Jay's here, and I hope you really, really enjoy it. I also wanted to give a big shout out to all the new members of the Homebrewed Christianity community. We have some really sweet partner schools like Drew at Claremont, Phillips Theological Seminary, and such that partner with the podcast and support it, keep it going. But also, we have a couple hundred people, like 120 or 130 people that donate every month, part of the Homebrewed community that support the podcast. And that's how it keeps happening and keeps coming to you. If you're interested in joining them, go to homebrewedcommunity.com. You'll find out how you can become an acolyte, a deacon, an elder, or even a bishop. We got a secret Facebook group where we share about like upcoming private things for all the members. You get like bonus episodes. You get all sorts of goodies. The Epic Reads group, which is our book club that Philip Clayton and I do, and bishops and elders all get tons of extra audio, like boot camps and things like that. Anyway, it's just our way of like having a reciprocal relationship with all the members that keep the podcast hopping, bopping, and popping right up into your earpiece. So thank you, all you members, for supporting it. And any of you that want to join, get more audiological goodness and keep it coming, head to homebrewedcommunity.com and you can find out how to do it. I'll just tell you all right now that we're in the middle of creating a whole new website, and it's going to be super duper sweet. And I can't tell you a whole lot about it because we're going to listen to this podcast. But don't worry, when it happens, I'll tell you. When it launches, there's going to be all kinds of new and exciting features. We even have a new online theological journal thingy I'm building. That's right. Like, we're once a month, you sign up, you get this email that is like the best of theology nerdom across the internet for the month. I'm excited about it. And not only that, it's going to have this new thing we're doing at Homebrewed called the Big Five. And the Big Five are like regular theologians that come on the podcast, the guests. They're going to send us like the 5 books that changed their mind in their theological journey, with like quotes, why it changed it or whatever for each one, and some other stuff. And then each month in the online theology journal, you'll hear like, oh, here's some really sweet theology blogs happening over here. Here's new books that are coming out. Here might be like really sweet controversy over here on the internet. Here's some really sweet like nerd tools, that kind of stuff. And you'll get delivered to you the different theologians' Big Five books, impact that change your mind, and all that kind of stuff. So we also have a couple theological webinars coming up in the near future. In July, we're doing one from Facebook to the Pulpit, Kyle Roberts at United Theological Seminary, talking about being a public theologian during an election year, and online and social media, and all that kind of junk. If you want to join it, then and that means you can join. You'll get the invite to join live, or you'll get sent the video a couple days after. I'll edit it up and deliver it to you. Then you can text Facebook Prophet, no space, but Facebook Prophet, to 44222 if you live in the U.S. 44222. Text Facebook Prophet, and you'll get signed up for the webinar. You'll get the invite to join live, ask questions, and send the replay. It's going to be a lot of fun. I've already been getting some questions about being like a minister, and it's election year, and how do you talk about this and that? How do you take stands in the pulpit prophetically without like breaking the law or like alienating members of your congregation? Tons of things I'm glad Kyle's going to be there to answer. You know what I'm saying? So text Facebook Prophet, no spaces, 44222 in the US of A. And if you're not a US citizen, and I don't know why the phones only let this happen if you are there, then you can go to the website or go to the Homebrewed Facebook group, and you can get links to the sign-up page, and it'll be all good. All right, here we go. Here is Jay. Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Tripp, and today I am with the Reverend Dr. J.E. Johnson from the Pacific School of Religion, which is part of the GTU out in Berkeley. And I think currently a reigning champ at Au Contraire Monfrere, definitely inspiring the most tweets about their responses. And you know what's funny is I had to edit out one of your responses, which was my favorite, just because iTunes doesn't like a couple words you used.
I can't wait to hear what those words were. Which was this?
Well, if I told you, you wouldn't it wouldn't be on the internet. But that's why it's a giant lure for people just to go like, who knows where this conversation's going. I had a great time when I was out at GTU, and it was awesome that Scott talked you into playing games with someone you haven't met before. And I'm real excited about this conversation, and we had been talking about having you on before, wrestling with queer theology and the body and sex, and all these type of conversations became pertinent. And so what I thought might be helpful is to frame a conversation that's more abstract and academic by pointing out the need in light of contemporary events for the church to take thoughtful, critical, and faithful reflection around these issues theologically seriously.
Absolutely, Tripp. Yeah, thanks. And I'm really excited to be having this conversation with you, and really honored, frankly, to be invited to do so. So thanks a lot for actually inviting me to be part of this. And we just happen to be doing this interview in the month of June, and we're coming up at the end of June, which here in the San Francisco Bay Area is Pride Week, Pride Weekend for LGBTQ people. I think often those of us in the Bay Area tend to take for granted a whole slew of things that the rest of the country doesn't take for granted. And recent events in Orlando, Florida, and the horrific shooting there and the killing of lots of people brings home the need for doing this kind of deconstructive and constructive theological work around the body, around sexuality, around love, around eros, around all sorts of things that actually makes a difference, not just for LGBT people, but for everybody. So I think it's a very important, though tragic reminder that Pride Month is not just about celebrating, but it's about doing our homework and about doing the hard work of building communities of tolerance and love and welcome and embrace. No small agenda there.
So when you're thinking of just the difference between how someone experiences the relationship of their sexual identity in relationship to their community of faith, say in in the Bay Area during a Pride Month with others across the country. Like, can you describe for people that may be on each end of it who are trying to wrestle with just the differences across the church and across the country, what it's like for a congregation to really not be arguing and fighting about that anymore, for those that are just, pushing for justice or even resisting change, and then what it's like for people who think, oh my goodness, really? Y'all talking about this again? This is such that's old news. Like, why for people in situations where that embrace isn't a given, why we need to keep discussing and pushing on these type of conversations? Yeah,
that's such a great question, Tripp. So let me approach responding to that this way. For many years, I did a lot of work trying to help the conversation in faith communities around LGBT people to move forward in a particular way toward welcoming and including LGBT people in faith communities more generally and broadly. And I kept not feeling very satisfied with how that work was moving along. And in many ways, it felt like, and still does in some ways, it reaches a kind of cul-de-sac or dead end in the conversation. It seems like people get hardened on both sides, or people don't understand why it matters, and the conversation doesn't move forward. And part of what I came to really believe is that the main reason for that is that we usually talk about sexuality in terms of morality and ethics first, and hardly ever talk about theology and spirituality when it comes to sexuality. In other words, that sexuality becomes the location for applying our theological ideas rather than the place where we actually develop our theological ideas and spiritual practices. So it seemed to me like one of the huge problems that we had faced, and still do face in many ways, is that Christian faith communities were being asked to make ethical and moral decisions without really doing the work of thinking theologically first about those. And so that reoriented what I thought this whole task was about. And so I'm not being flippant about this at all, but what I came to was, what Christian faith communities haven't really addressed is the question of, like, sex. What's it good for? What?
More than war.
Or what's it for? Like, if we didn't ask ourselves, what do we want to say theologically and spiritually about sex first, then we're never going to get to these questions around LGBT issues and relationships and love. So I actually tried to write a book, and did write a book about this, trying to invite Christian communities to think much more deeply theologically about why sex matters to our understanding of Christian faith. And we could have a long conversation about that, but I think that's the place to really locate these questions and these issues, is first in our theological ideas, and then to think about morality and ethics, if that makes sense.
No, I mean, I think it does, because there is such a history, at least in American Christianity, of combining kind of Platonist disregard for the body with Puritan guilt complex, and
yes.
Like the wonderful gift that is hegemonic religious silencing. So that, I remember as a campus minister at UNC Greensboro, getting a call from a student who had recently gotten married, and his concern was that he had too much fun on his honeymoon. Because this is not a Catholic. His wife's on birth control, and he's like, we were in the Bahamas for a week, and we only prayed once.
I would submit that that's probably a mistaken counting of how many times they prayed. I mean, I think they were probably praying all the time. But I mean, so Tripp, what you just reminded me of, something that is very odd about historical Christian traditions. There are many things that are odd about those traditions. One of them is how little material there is in historical Christian traditions about a theology of pleasure. Theologians hardly ever write about this in the history of Christianity. There's a lot about suffering. There's a lot about pain. There's a lot about all sorts of other things that aren't related to pleasure. So why isn't there more material there? It's there. You just have to look sort of differently for it. And part of what I find exciting and important about doing the work around sexuality and the body is that it takes us back into some of these historical traditions that have been neglected, overlooked, repressed in contemporary Christianity, and it opens up a much more deeply textured, rich history of Christian traditions for us to work with. And that's why it's not just about LGBT people, but the LGBT questions can lead us into some really wonderful traditions and texts and spiritual practices that can invite a much broader range of people into the orbit of Christian practice, which I find really exciting.
So can you describe the moment you realized the body was a real theological topic? Because I feel like that's it's not immediately obvious in most congregations that it's a topic. And then when it is, it's always some other's body that we legislate. And through church history, there's been a whole bunch of different ones. First in the New Testament, we're legislating Gentile bodies, which, heads up, it's about cutting skin off your penis.
Yes.
If you don't think it is, just get up in front of your congregation next Sunday and tell them, before you ask Jesus in your heart, you got to go snip, snip. And then you'll discover that was not just about the Holy Spirit being embracing. It was about bodies. Then we did it with women's bodies. We did it with the privileged spiritual ones can't enjoy the physical company of others. There are so many times that bodies are at the very heart of theological debates. And yet it's always the other's body. And it's not the body we think we're talking about. It's some other that is we need to draw a distinction from for our own identity as the holy, pure, sanctified people who don't have parts and enjoy them.
And you know what? Thank you. That is such a great question, and it does get to what I think is hugely important in our day and age around doing this work, because it isn't only about LGBT bodies. It's also about women's bodies. It's also about people of color. So the intersections of sexuality and gender and race and ethnicity and also class, all of these things are embodied realities in our society and in our churches. I'm fascinated by some stuff I'm reading just recently about the history of modern Western language, European languages, and so on. And the way that in the European Enlightenment, for example, the elevation not only of human reason, but also of abstract conceptualization. Right. So ideas and concepts that are farther and farther removed from actual concrete on the ground realities in large measure served three distinct purposes. One, to elevate male over female, right? So that you can make the argument somehow that masculinity is more rational, femininity is more passionate and emotional. Two, to elevate white people over people of color. So that you have all these weird scientific texts and treatises about white people having particular kinds of abstract conceptual gifts. People of color don't. And then elevating humans over all other creatures on the planet, right? That only humans somehow have this ability for abstract conceptualization. Sounds like it's a distraction, but actually part of what I find so important about that is to go back, realizing how white men get elevated by ignoring or repressing bodily realities can send us all the way back to the first chapter of John's Gospel, where what matters, what frames the entire notion of Johannine Christianity, is that the Word of God appears among us as flesh. That's where we recognize it. And you can read John, I think, as really claiming and arguing that the only way we know God is with and in bodies, which was a huge claim in first century and second century Christianity that has been mostly, I think, repressed and lost over the last couple of centuries. And notice, Tripp, I know that you already have, but that dealing with LGBT issues can trigger all of those insights about modern Western history and philosophy that sends us back to some of our originating texts in Christianity that can shed new insights on our faith and spirituality today. So it's not just about LGBT issues as much as those are terribly important, but they raise then these questions about the body and about bodily relations and what these have to do with Christian faith and practice. I think I was just rambling, but I hope that made sense.
Well, that's what podcasts are for, is having a rambling theological conversation. So you're succeeding.
Oh, good.
When you bring up the kind of Logos opening to John, something popped up, namely like that Logos Christologies actually were one of the biggest tools the church came up with to avoid Jesus's Jewishness and his embodiedness, even though no one that's a Jew or a Stoic would be surprised that there's a Logos that's connected to the way the world works. The shocking part would have been that it took up sarx, which is like flesh, like materiality, not like a person in the Greek. And that the part of the thing that stuck out to me for a long time is it says he came to his own and they knew him not. At least in the King James, which makes it sound deeper. And when you think of the fact that there's this tendency for abstraction, for a dualism that places value outside of the realm of sarxiness, the Logos became flesh, came to his own, the material existence, the fruit of this kind of divine investment in the world, and they knew him not, really points out that the embodiment, the embodied word of God is also the excluded and ignored one. And it should give us a hermeneutic as the church to expect to learn from the bodies that are excluded and ignored. And thought about that. I like that. I'm going to have to add that into the Logos section of my dissertation.
Awesome. And part of what you're getting, you're pointing to here, which I think is hugely important, is what I would call the tendency in modern Western Christianity to proclaim what I call the escape hatch version of Christian faith. So the way in which the Logos becoming flesh is really for the purpose of mounting a rescue mission for humanity that's gotten trapped in all this earthly messiness, and that the whole purpose of Christian faith is somehow to believe in the one who came to take us out of that fleshy stuff to this literally disembodied place called heaven, which of course is completely contrary to most of the history of Christian reflection on the importance of incarnation. It's so odd, fascinating, troubling, disturbing how so many in the United States and other parts of the world have come to believe escape hatch Christianity as the way that Christianity has always been proclaimed, when in fact it's very much a modern kind of distortion of the gospel. Just one little weird geeky note here is part of what I've been wanting to get into recently is ancient Syriac Christianity. And why, you might ask, would I be wanting to do that? Because the kind of ancient Christianity that took root in present-day Syria took root well before gospel texts were in circulation, and yet they were profoundly incarnational communities. So much so that they made arguments, for example, that it requires praising God. You must have a body in order to praise God, that without bodies you can't engage in the kind of divine doxology that we are made for. And so after we die, our disembodied spirits are kind of waiting around in this liminal airport waiting room, waiting for our bodies to catch up, because we can't praise God until we are embodied again. And it sounds crazy in a way, but also really beautiful and wonderful that the reason that we have bodies is to praise God. I did not grow up hearing about Christianity that way. So again, the dealing with sexuality and LGBT issues has been so great, not just for the work of social justice and inclusion, which is really important, but because it prompts and generates all of this retrieval of important insights from historical traditions.
So what does talking about sex and sexuality spiritually look and sound like?
Oh, that's a really great question. Let me approach that question this way. One of the things that I've noticed in doing this work, and in my book, Divine Communion, which is devoted to this whole topic about what does sexuality have to do with Christian faith. One of the things that I find fascinating is that in the first 2 or 3 centuries of Christian traditions, the way that a theologian read Genesis 1 through 3 made all the difference in how that theologian articulated the purpose of Christian faith. Mm-hmm. And it's fascinating because there are different approaches in those first few centuries to Christianity. And those differences are often quite easily mapped to the differences in how one reads Genesis. And what I noticed in there too is you can read Genesis 3, as you may remember, Tripp. Genesis 3 is where things go kind of wrong in the story, right? Adam and Eve supposedly do something, they make a mistake. You can read Genesis 3 as about guilt over having made a mistake. Certainly that's right. If you do, guilt over having made a mistake will likely lead you to a version of Christianity where forgiveness is the point, and therefore a doctrine of atonement is needed in order for that kind of arc to be completed. But that's not the only way to read Genesis 3. Another really important way to read it is to read it as being about shame, as being about bodily shame. And if that's the concern that rises up out of that story, then you're likely to approach Christian faith as a way to heal bodily shame rather than to forgive guilt. And I would say the incarnation is the more likely place one goes to for healing bodily shame. You can't forgive someone for their shame. You can only love them into being healed from it. And I raise this, Tripp, because the horrific violence that we've seen this month in Orlando at a gay nightclub, if it's true that the shooter in that incident was also dealing with being gay or attracted to other men, I think an important insight can come out of this tragedy about the way that shame can be turned outward into aggression, hostility, and violence. So I mentioned that as a way to say these are not just abstract theological ideas. They have really important socio-political consequences around sexuality, around gender, around race, around ethnicity. Mm-hmm. The way that we understand our bodily relations with one another. That's kind of a backdoor answer to your question, but I think to start talking about sexuality theologically is to start talking about healing the shame that I think we all experience around our bodies.
Well, what it makes me think of is a conversation I had with a very conservative Baptist friend of mine who could not understand their people mentioning a gay nightclub as a place of spiritual refuge and belonging. And, immediately I was like, have you ever actually gone dancing? Because, that's, that tends to be what I first concerned about with Baptist ministers. But, I hadn't thought about framing it that way. Like, if your identity as the embodied excluded is a guilt issue, hiding together in this nightclub in the dark and dancing is just hiding your guilt. If it's a shame issue, it's like creating a space where that shame is not over you, and
absolutely
there's celebration.
Absolutely. And yes, thank you, because I really do, in my own experience, I identify as a gay man who's a little bit queer around the edges. In my own experience over the years, I have found gay nightclubs, dance clubs, and so on to be truly places to shed and shake off all those layers of bodily shame in ways that I think churches ought to be doing as well, but have not recognized the importance of doing that in the same way. In other words, for an awfully long time, churches have been proclaiming the gospel as a way to find forgiveness for guilt. Sure, that's important. But to ignore, as so many churches have done, the importance of healing bodily shame is to leave a huge issue unaddressed for so many people. I would say that gay nightclubs, gay dance clubs actually have something hugely important to teach Christian churches about what it means to create a sanctuary space for people to heal from shame. There was this great moment trip here in Oakland, California, at an evening vigil shortly after the shooting at that club in Orlando. And one of the speakers, as you know, this happened almost at the same time as the first anniversary of the shooting at the African American church in Charleston, South Carolina. And the speaker at this vigil in Oakland got up and said, when they want to come for black people, they go to churches. When they want to come for gay people, they go to dance clubs. And someone in the audience said, sanctuary is sanctuary, right? And so the place of profound encounter is also the place of profound vulnerability. That's called sanctuary.
Well, that kind of story makes me think of a moment when, as a minister doing confirmation class or pastor's class if it's disciples of Christ, and I always make them wait till they're 16, because unless you can kill someone with a car, I don't think you could like have an adult identity as a member of Team Jesus. But I would always assign them to they have to throw a party as one of the things for their project. And one of them, one of the years, they decided to have a funk off where them and their the elderly member of the congregation they're not related to, who they had to meet with multiple times, hear their story of faith, and share it with the group. They were going to recruit people to dance for 3 hours straight, and get people to sponsor their dancing, and then have this party where you funk for food because all the money was going to nonprofit. And like when it happens, it goes great, and it's first time something like this had ever happened in the church, so there was like lots of really weird, awkward questions that were asked. But I remember after it, one of the older guys that had come and begrudgingly got peer pressured into dancing with a very good-looking high school girl, which he didn't look too disappointed about it, after he started. And he comes up to me and he goes, walks in my office and announces his trip. I want you to tell you something about your, I don't like saying funk off. I'm uncomfortable with that, but you can actually dance with a good-looking woman without thinking like dirty thoughts. And I was like, yeah. I mean, you're 50 years older than her. I hope so. I was at the senior Bible study yesterday morning, and we were all talking about it. None of us ever thought about dancing, if it wasn't like in the context of like courtship or dating or something like that. And that was just fun. And so like, and I, in this conversation, I thought, well, that's really sad. Like at your church, you could not imagine dancing with your granddaughter's friend and just having joy while Michael Jackson's playing. Like how is ABC 1, 2, 3 not something that everyone who has the gift of language could celebrate with their peers? Like, so I think that shame thing exists in the church. It's just we have really weird ways of covering it up as just straight people, but we don't acknowledge it when there is real guilt that is keeping us from covering over this like shame problem. When we have bodies and we have relationships and friendships that can, like, dancing is awesome.
Exactly. No, exactly. And one of the things, and you know, I don't want to imply that somehow gay dance clubs and nightclubs are these perfect idyllic spaces and so on. They aren't, just like churches aren't either.
Really? Churches aren't?
No, well, I hate to break that to you. I know that's kind of shocking. All of these spaces are human spaces, and they're vulnerable to all of our human faults and foibles and so on. At the same time, however, one of the things I've loved over the years about gay dance clubs and nightclubs is that you actually can and often do dance with everybody else who's out on the dance floor. It's not just about couples. It's about figuring out ways bodily to engage in some kind of community with others. Mm-hmm. A sense of solidarity through actual bodily movement. And it seems to me like, wow, churches could really learn a lot from that kind of approach to spiritual practice.
So in Divine Communion, and the subtitle is A Eucharistic Theology of Sexual Intimacy, which I just feel like you had a branding success right there. Some people may never open the book because they're like, whoa. Sexual intimacy, when they hear the word, is going to immediately be connected to some divine prohibition. To associate the Eucharist with that is probably traumatic. And then if they had just read the title, Divine Communion, they're like, look, this is good Orthodox Christian theology. They read the subtitle. So in a book like that, like, how would you describe this, the theological argument about why sex matters in Christian theology and for Christian faith, not in the abstract sense, but like, what are the constructive proposals and benefits that come by associating the Eucharist and God with getting jiggy?
All right. Now we get down to it. Yes. So, great question. Let me take this run at it. Part of my own approach trip changed really dramatically when I read a book by Elizabeth Stewart back in 2003. The book was called Repetitions with Critical Difference, Gay and Lesbian Theologies, or something like that. It was a big life changer for me. And the reason was she opened the book in trying, weirdly, doing an analysis of Dante's Purgatorio. And I'm like, wait a minute, I can't even remember what Dante's Purgatorio is about in any detail. And she's starting a book on gay and lesbian theologies by doing an analysis of that. And the subtitle of the first chapter was What Happens to Sodomites When They Die? And then the next subchapter is What Happens to Lesbians When They Die? I'm like, who is this person and what is going on here? Here was her point. She was trying to argue that both liberals and conservatives in the contemporary same-sex marriage debate had basically abandoned Christian traditions around the meaning of marriage. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. What's going on here? And what she said was both liberals and conservatives have been arguing that marriage is somehow the fulfillment of human life. That if you really want to live a full and whole and complete life, you get married. And what Elizabeth Stewart argued in that book is that Christian traditions have never said that until the modern West. What Christian traditions have said instead is that what marriage offers, what eros, what erotic desire, what sexual intimacy offers is an awakening of our own desire for God. Mm-hmm. And a way to recognize how much God desires us. So it broadens out erotic desire in some really helpful ways. And so that sent me off down this trail on what does sex offer us in Christian faith and theology? It offers us a chance to recognize that, first of all, erotic desire resides with God. We are made in God's image. We are erotic creatures because God is erotic. And the place to really focus and hone in on this, I think, is the Eucharistic table. What happens there is God offers God's own self to us in vulnerability and intimacy because God desires us. And to think of the Eucharist in that way, for me, was a complete reorientation around the good news of the gospel, frankly. And I remember, I know I'm thankful this is a podcast, so I get to ramble like this. But a wonderful little essay by Rowan Williams some years ago called "The Body's Grace." In it, he has this really arresting sentence in which he writes, and I repeat this to people all the time. He says basically the whole arc of Christian tradition, from creation to salvation, our incorporation into Christ's body, tells us just one thing. That whole story tells us one thing, that God desires us. And what I find so fascinating about that is he didn't say that God loves us. I mean, obviously, Rowan Williams would say, yes, of course, God loves us. But love comes with so many caveats with us so frequently. It's like, well, I'll love you until you don't do things that I want you to do, and so on and so on. But desire carries this whole other kind of range of energy and passion to it. If I say I desire you, I desire to be in relationship with you, I desire intimacy with you, it carries a much more profound kind of weight, I think. And to imagine that what the gospel is trying to tell us is that this is God's posture toward us. We don't have to get God's attention. We don't have to persuade God that we're good enough. We don't have to do the right things. God just finds us desirable. And I would argue, Tripp, that if we actually created and sustained Christian communities in which everybody understood themselves to be desired and desirable, we would be on a path towards social transformation to deal with sexism and racism, ethnocentrism, all of these issues. I really do believe that that's at the root of it.
Well, and I think that there, like underneath that is a type of affirmation of one's being that is not said when you have this abstract, universal love type of yes. God loves everybody type of statement. Because you're like, yeah, well, I know God loves everybody. You say that, and then in your head, you're thinking, but.
Exactly.
And actually, what's odd is how much that insight is connected to those breakthrough moments, like in early Protestantism, like that's the Luther's yes. divine exchange, yes. or like Kierkegaard telling the story of the king and the lowly maiden. All of these are ways of describing how the love of God, once it's contextualized through Jesus, isn't this generic love for everything. It's God's free, loving decision to refuse to be God without us.
Exactly. So what Jesus tells these amazing parables, right, of the woman furiously sweeping her house to find this one lost coin, and the pearl of great price, and the 100th sheep that's lost, and these passionate images of a passionate God who cannot live without us in some way. And to bring those into our contemporary culture where so many of us cannot look in the mirror in the morning and find a desirable creature there because the culture around us says we're not rich enough, we're not handsome enough, we're not thin enough, we're not well connected enough, we're not smart enough, we didn't grow up in the right neighborhoods, we didn't go to the right school. The number of things that are wrong with us that constantly tell us that we're not desirable. And that just fuels our bodily shame. It fuels our epidemic of isolation and alienation, of depression. Why are prescriptions for Prozac on the rise? Look at the hostility, the violence in the world. The Christian theology has something to offer to all of this, and Christian faith communities, if we can figure out how to get our act together with those.
Well, I think what you're pointing out is that a lot of people have like a playlist of truths about themselves running through their head, and that for many of us, there are ones that are absolutely not true that we believe are true. And even if they aren't true, they inscribe themselves on our material embodied existence.
Yes.
Because we believe they're true. And
yes.
And the gospel is this like passionate affirmation that you are my beloved. And maybe I am a Protestant, so it makes me excited, but like that affirmation of your embodied being, that you are God's beloved, and that's the most true thing about you, not what parents or culture, minister, or even you say about yourself. Like, that's powerful. And what I'm interested in is how we connect that type of robust gospel affirmation to help us who are more progressive deal with these issues that you could see as like cultural, political, sociological, and that type of thing differently. Because I know there's a sense where or there's a temptation, at least, to want to silence the lies that are being said that linger in people's ears, and that's our mission as progressive Christians. We got to cut those voices out or whatever. And in turning our attention there first, we miss the power of emphasizing and stating beautifully and attractively the gospel message, which just kills the power of the other one when it's received. Does that make sense?
It totally does. So another way, part of what you're evoking for me, Tripp, is one of my passions and commitments as both an Episcopal priest and a theologian, academic theologian. I want to connect much more deeply the formation in Eucharistic communities and the work of social justice. I think for many liberal, progressive Christian communities, these are still separated too distinctly. That there's somehow liturgy is some kind of an individual thing, and yeah, that's nice. But really what's important is that we get out there and work to end white supremacy and to deal with our income and economic inequality and so on. It's time, I think, to bring these things much more closely together and align our work of creating Eucharistic communities of healing and liberation as locations for social transformation. That's what excites me, so that we don't have this constant split between kind of liturgical formation on one hand and out there in the world or in the streets doing social justice on the other, that these are deeply interconnected with one another. Just to back up for a second, another thing that it excites me and gets me that really fuels my passion for this work is to notice, because, I didn't grow up in the Episcopal Church. I grew up in the Evangelical Free Church of America. Mm-hmm. And the kind of Christianity I thought that was just Christianity, that's what it is. That's the way it's always been. And to discover a much deeper, broader, richer history of theological ideas. Just one example that bears on what we're talking about here, Tripp. For centuries, one of the most important texts in the Bible was the Song of Songs. It's this little love poem stuck in this place in the Hebrew Bible that most Christians probably can't even find.
Well, you have to hide it from your middle schoolers.
Exactly, because right is like we got eros right in the middle of the Bible. It's not in the lectionary. It doesn't appear in the lectionary anywhere for Sunday readings in the Episcopal Church, for example. But what's fascinating is that for centuries, the Song of Songs was the most copied manuscript in the medieval church. It was the one that was most frequently preached on. It was the one most widely read, even more than the gospel texts. It was the one that was most often referred to in commentaries. Why? What's that? And God's not even mentioned in that little book. Because all of these theologians and monastic communities and others were convinced that only erotic language suffices for talking about God. The only way we can talk about God and our relationship with God is by using the language of eros, which is what makes our own bodily relations with each other of prime significance in Christian faith and spirituality.
So this makes me think of a pet peeve of mine. So I'm just going to say it so that I'm interested in your response. It drives me nuts when postmodern, post-structuralist type Christian theologians, not the others, get all hung up on Platonic apophatic retrieval. Because I think what you're highlighting is that incarnational apophaticism goes to the erotic and the embodied. And that if we're going to be Christian theologians, we aren't going to perpetually defer and disempower embodied words and even our spoken words. We're going to insist on embracing the particularity of every embodied word, and that the Christian community is the gathering across the embodied differences and not the negating of our testimonies and affirmations and cataphatic. That it really blows my I get irritated about it. Like
I agree. So I think there are here's why I like apophatic mystical theologians in the traditions, because what they say mostly is we cannot capture God in our systems of thought. But what we can do is encounter God in other bodies and our own bodies. I think that that's the very essence of an incarnational faith. Marcella Althaus Reed, this wonderful, wacky, I loved her, Argentinian liberation theologian, queer theologian. In one of her books, I think it's in Decent Theology, she writes, when God chooses to speak, God speaks through bodies. And you can see that actually throughout the biblical texts, and on into Christian traditions as well. The way that we form communities, I think, or ought to be forming communities, is through paying attention to how God is speaking through the bodies around us. I think that's a profoundly Christian approach to building community.
Yeah, and it doesn't lead to to theologians specializing in saying nothing and never using declarative sentences.
No, that's right.
I mean, I've read some dissertations because I was friends with someone and circled the 2 times they made a declarative sentence. And I say, like, I thought it was a theological dissertation. Like, how many years after the resurrection of Jesus does it take for you to believe that you actually are allowed to say something? Like, guess what? When you're dead, no one's going to care what we said. They'll still read the same Gospels and keep talking about it. So you don't have to worry that you're going to have some undue power. Like, everyone gets ignored and told they're wrong later. We're going to keep arguing on text, but you can at least say something about where you are right now from your perspective, because, like, as Christians, we don't get together and have communion. We aren't baptized into a dead Christ, but the body of the risen Christ, who is about as diverse as it gets. Jesus has never been more diverse than today, and we've never had ears wide enough to hear as many parts of Christ's body speaking as today. Like, we should be able to do more constructive theology now that doesn't suck than any other point in time in history.
Yes.
Like, this is like the coolest time to do theology. And
yes.
Anyway, this is why I always find that like Episcopal, progressive, post-structuralist types tend to care about bodies more than those from free church traditions, the more liturgical ones, or Lutherans will do it as well. Like, even people give Luther crap, and he has plenty of reasons to. But that he insisted that having a vocation and doing something in the world is a sacred activity, and that using your body and sharing it with another and having a family and all those things are as sacred as
absolutely.
Like, those were affirmations of bodies that form got essentialized, that then is oppressive today. But the Reformation insistence on like what we do, who we love, and all those things are the very places the gospel shows up. That's still a radical thing. It just needs to get said out of different types of mouths than just slightly anti-Semitic constipated Germans.
I could not agree with you more. And so my book Divine Communion is really rooted in food, sex, and God, and the insistence that these three things have always been deeply intertwined with each other. So that's why the Eucharist I find so incredibly important, because it's a table set with food, actual physical things, bread and wine, and this constant telling of the story of God's own vulnerability, God's wanting to be intimate with us.
If you had titled your book "Eat, Pray, Love," that's three topics.
Another edition of the book. That's going to be the title.
I feel like that would be catchy. I'm optimistic. So the other topic that I wanted to make sure we got to, because we even brought it up. You did this 60-second what is queer theology for Flyover Country thing when we got together. But in your book, Peculiar Faith, Queer Theology for Christian Witness, that text challenges the church in a different way. Like, I feel like the boring challenge of inclusion is, all right, here's what we're going to do, friends. There used to be these groups. Let's just essentialize everyone with different letters. How about that? That's convenient. Now, there's some that have negative signs next to them. And then there's the white straight guy who's always had a plus sign. Let's just keep adding lines over the negatives so that everyone can be a part of the system that already exists. There's no need to change it. We're going to battle, and then we're going to win. And we're going to feel liberal and inclusive because our sign says open and affirming. And all we've done is let other people join a community who feels better about itself now, obviously, and superior. But the challenge of the book, and what I really enjoyed about our conversation after last time, was how the Christian inclusion into the body of Christ changes the community itself, and it doesn't essentialize everyone into the system that already was there.
Yes, you just said that so beautifully. And so one of the things that I have found so energizing about trying to deal theologically with queer theory, and queer theory is very difficult to define and describe. There are as many definitions of it as there are people trying to use it. But the insight that came to me about that is what you brought up earlier about Gentiles in the Christian New Testament. So the earliest Christians who were Jewish were struggling mightily with the question of whether or not to include Gentiles into this early movement, right? And so you have this profound moment in Acts 15 where this decision is being made in Jerusalem. The thing that's so important to me, it's one of the many things that are important in that story, is that the community does not stay the same after they decide to include Gentiles. Their understanding of religion, their understanding of faith changes. It's not just like everything stays the same, we just have more people. No, it's actually, we have a different understanding now of the faith. And I thought, what would it look like then for Christian faith communities who are including lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer people? What's going to change? Because if we're really including them, then something is going to shift about an understanding of faith and spiritual practice. That's what this book is about. And even more, this is what I said during the time that you were here in Berkeley, but I really believe it. I think to be Christian is to be queer in the modern West. It's not about, queer is a way of understanding how Christian faith puts us at odds with imperial power, which is what we live in the midst of right now. I know I just made some leaps, but that's the brief version of that.
Well, can you say a bit about how the concept or notion of queer, even without applying it necessarily to theology,
Sure.
developed in that ever-growing list of letters?
Yes.
Like what's the twist or unique part?
Sure. Yeah. So, and always with this caveat that this is my understanding of how queer theory operates, and the insights that I have gleaned from reading queer theorists about this. So, as most people probably realize, the word queer is synonyms for queer are like odd, strange, bizarre, peculiar, or just more generally, it doesn't fit with the others, right? And so queer very early on in the late 19th, early 20th century was a very common way of basically deriding those who were attracted to members of the same sex, or that their gender performance was different, or so on. It was a derisive term. We all know that. You call somebody queer and it's not a good term. But then part of what emerged in the late 80s and into the 90s was this realization, exactly what you were talking about, Tripp, that the way that people get categorized as lesbian, as gay, as bisexual, as transgender, but also around race, and also around the binary gender system. That there's very definitely something called maleness and something very definitely called femaleness. What queer theorists were trying to analyze and to parse and to discern is the effects of the strict classification scheme. On how we divide the human race into these little boxes, and especially the way in which most people don't fit any of these boxes. And the purpose, therefore, of the classification scheme at all is to keep certain people in power. As you were mentioning, it's sort of like the white straight male is the one without any box. Everybody else is in the box, right? In order to keep the white straight male as the one who has all the power.
I tend to think like it's more like white straight guys or the white paper everyone else's box get written on.
Yes, exactly.
Like it is like, and that's why I think it's important to have the conversation, because I know, like, growing up as a minister's kid in the South, if I hadn't gone to art magnet school, where it was like the one place a Baptist minister's kid had to have Jewish and gay friends,
yes.
My output would have been different. If my dad hadn't volunteered to help with the Baptist AIDS partnership, and I led music at spiritual retreats for people with HIV/AIDS and their caretakers, and had transvestite friends and cross-dressing friends when I was young, I know what I would have been like, because I can see my friends' Facebook feeds. And the way the conversation comes across to so many people is like is where they're unaware that they're essentially the paper everyone else's box gets put on. And you are so blind to that kind of white male privilege that just drawing boxes is offensive. Yes. It's not that you even like this. You're like, why is there a box there? This is a nice, white, clean piece of paper called humans. And
yes.
Anyway, I just always think it's important, especially people listening to podcasts that are like way past this conversation, and those that this is the first time. It's important to pause long enough to see where it is the ideology is brought visible. Because until it's visible, you can't really repent and change. There
was no such. Heterosexuals did not exist until homosexuals did. That's one way of sort of blowing people's minds in order to see how these categories were invented. So prior to the late 19th century, this is also really strange to so many people. And it is strange because we're so accustomed to other ways of thinking about this. But prior to the late 19th century, same-sex sexual activity was something that everybody was potentially attracted to or could fall into or was tempted to participate in. And that explains in part why in Revolutionary era America, preachers were so often railing against falling into sodomy. It's sort of like, geez, was the whole country overrun with gay people? Why were they so concerned about this? Because for the perspective then was that anybody could be tempted to this kind of behavior. It wasn't just so-called gay people, because gay people didn't exist as a category. So late in the 19th century, German sexology researchers created basically a medical category called the homosexual that reoriented our approach to these things dramatically. So now we had people who were acting out of their identity as a homosexual. And that meant that there were others who were heterosexual and so on. And this was also at the same time that the binary gender system was becoming much more essentialized in terms of maleness and femaleness. That also got mapped to race, that there's a distinct difference between biological races. That's new to the modern West. That's not an ancient idea at all. So queer theorists have been trying to explode these whole notions of neat and tidy categories that are most often used for the sake of oppressing others and elevating others. And I think that's what gets right at the heart of what Jesus was up to actually in the gospel texts in terms of his resistance to imperial power and classification schemes.
So when someone's first kind of becoming familiar with even the way the conversation works, I regularly have people ask, like, well, what's the difference between your gender and your sexuality, and why do they keep saying the word performance? And I had an email the other day of a friend, and he's a United Methodist, and they've recently had some issues come up. He's a minister in flyover country, and was trying to, be a vocal ally. And he said, we can't hate them this way because they were born this way, and then was reprimanded for using the born this way argument. And he is like, I thought this was what I was supposed to say. And so oftentimes, like, a lot of people don't know where to go to find out even how to be a straight ally and even what in the world the conversation is, because they're still just creeped out that there's anything else other than themselves. And they're like, I know I shouldn't feel this way, so I got to do something different. And so can you help kind of like describe how the language functions in this conversation, and how even certain forms of being an ally are problematized once you kind of make the queer observation?
Wow, that's such a great question. And let me just reassure as many people as possible by saying this. This is something that I deal with as part of my vocation, my professional career, my professional work, my writing and my teaching, and I often get it wrong. So and getting it wrong means it's really hard to keep up with the language. Mm-hmm. Once you realize that these categories and classifications have been deployed and even created for the sake of maintaining the power of some over others, then language for identity itself becomes just hugely problematic. And it becomes very difficult to keep up with how some people will prefer to be referred to. And so I would say, first of all, when trying to be, and I say this to myself all the time, and trying to be a good ally around race, around gender, around sexuality, all of these things, listen really carefully and don't be afraid to actually just ask. Like, I want to be helpful. How would you prefer that I speak about these things and help me understand what's going on? I try to do that all the time. The other thing is the question that you asked right at the beginning about the difference between sex and gender. Oh, good Lord. So this is where our language, our modern Western language, just fails us. Because we're so accustomed, so many of us have been raised and taught and trained to think about things like, well, sex refers to sort of our biological bodily features, and gender is the expression of that, and so on. Well, that's all just up in the air. It's become very difficult to figure out how to parse those words. Let me just offer this. Even biologists these days are trying to get us to realize that just two so-called genders are not enough to describe any mammal, including humans. That there's a lot more diversity in the way that we are made biologically than just two categories will suffice to describe. That's one thing to remember. The other is this issue of performance and performativity that you asked about, Tripp. One way to think about it is the way that someone expresses, let's say, masculinity is going to differ from the United States compared to Indonesia, compared to the depths of China. And the part of what that helps us to realize is, given all these differences about how men supposedly behave in public, suggests that these things aren't particularly rooted in biology and the way that our bodies are. They're very much rooted in cultural ways of behaving. They are much more like following a cultural script, which is where that notion of a performance comes from. And so there's a sense in which there is a much more latitude and variety out there in the world in terms of what biology means around sex and gender, and also how each of us manifests it, and how each of us is shaped and formed and trained by the culture around us to manifest these things.
One of the things that I think at least popped into my head when I probably was when I was assigned Judith Butler to read. That's probably when it first happened. But in that kind of notion of like queer, and then you listed off all the synonyms, right, that you mentioned a bit before. But there's also a synonym that's very religious you didn't say, and that's holy.
Yes.
Like holy is to be set apart. It's to be. It is to be queer. And what I find odd in the protectiveness of kind of heteronormativity in the church is its insistence that your identity in the body of Christ not threaten your national identity, your familial identity, your cultural identity, and this type of thing. When that seems to be like we have a religion whose main documents in the New Testament are about a single dude who hangs out with 12 men and gets axed and has older women fund his journey and has mommy issues, and a formerly married man who is so obsessed with the end of the world and his penis that if he starts talking about it, we don't even know what to do anymore. And then he's like have these crazy erotic images of God and love, and and his favorite topic is the death of the single dude who went around with 12 guys. To me, there's a certain a gift that queer theology gives the Christian community at a time where we're so tempted to be the chaplain of empire, rather to kind of recognize that and discover a holy vocation.
I love it. So, yes. And one of the things that, just one among many connections like that, is I think, very helpful reminder that the word ecclesiology, the ecclesia for church, comes from a verb that actually means to call out, to be called out. Church is a community of called out people. And there's a section in my book, Peculiar Faith, in which I try to suggest that the experience of gay and lesbian people coming out is a very helpful one for all Christians to reflect on in terms of our calling to be out in the world as set apart from the normative imperial script that we've been handed, that we are now recognizing more and more as being deeply destructive, not just to our communities, but to the whole environment, right? Mm-hmm. We've got an ecological crisis on our hands. We need to be called out from those dominant scripts. Again, I think being Christian means being queer in Western society. So yes, to everything you just said about being holy and set apart. Absolutely.
Well, it's very rare that queer training could be associated with sanctification training, but I feel like that could be the United Methodist next.
Yes.
Radical queering for discipleship. So yes. So when you're thinking of the situation that the American church is in today around these issues, like, how does that connect to the way you see like the Episcopal Church and its connection to the larger global Episcopal Church, where we can have passionate advocacy and progress being made here that to other parts of our same ecclesial communion feel like a threat, like imperialism and this type of thing? How do we negotiate that? Because what's happening in the Episcopal Church, I think, actually happens in American denominations that have yet to make as much progress as the Episcopal Church has.
So, yeah, great question, and a really vexing one, because one of the ways that I think about this is, the charge from, let's just say, on the African continent, the charge is often made by our siblings in faith there that we in the West have somehow exported homosexuality to the African continent. I actually think that what we've done instead is exported homophobia to the African continent. And by that I mean we have these categorical classification schemes that we were talking about, you and I, just a moment ago, the creation of a category called homosexuality. We exported that kind of approach to places outside of Western society that has deeply shaped and affected these communities. And we're actually paying the price for our own colonial exports on that. That's one thing that I try to keep in mind. The other thing that I try to keep in mind, and the former presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, Frank Griswold, tells this story about his time as presiding bishop when he would talk with his African counterparts in different parts of the African continent. And they would tell him, Frank, it's not about getting better biblical exegesis about homosexuality. That's not the issue. It's not like now you just have to tell us how to read the Bible and things are going to be different. It's about an entirely different worldview that you're asking us to change. And what's fascinating to me is that worldview has to do with gender and with race and with economics and politics and all sorts of things. It's not an isolated question to deal with lesbian and gay relationships, for example. That is embedded in these much larger systems that won't be addressed effectively by just saying, here's an updated biblical exegesis guide for you about the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. No, it's about a much, much larger set of systems. So I think if we, that's in part why just to keep self-promoting here, if you don't mind, but the book Divine Communion is a way to say, don't start with the lesbian and gay question first. That's actually not helpful. What is much more helpful, I think, for anybody, for any community, is to start with the sex question. Like, why does sex matter to Christian faith and theology? How do we want to speak theologically about it? How do we want to understand it spiritually? And then move from there into thinking about gay and lesbian issues. But don't start with the kind of highly charged question first. Start with that broader one.
Mm-hmm. No, and I think it's important to realize avoiding the at least beginning of the church having more thoughtful conversations around embodiment and sex and pleasure and things. Like, if you avoid that, we're in for some trouble. Like, I have friends that are part of a number of entrepreneurial startups that are working on AI and like 3D imaging porn.
Yes.
You tell me the percentage of teenage boys who will have a 3D printer and the possibility of, when parents go to bed, simulating encounters with large numbers of people on the internet and never anyone knowing about it. Like, if you can't talk about bodies and sex and stuff now, then like, how destructive is it to continue through the use of technology and things to give people outlets that are all shame-based because of how we framed it? Like,
that's right.
It's not like the conversations aren't had in the church. They're just not had out loud.
Yes, that's right.
And that's I think the imperative is to realize, like, if you don't have the conversation, it still gets had. It's just not one in the context that is affirming the full dignity and subjectivity of whoever is engaged in any physical interaction, be it like dancing with someone 50 years older than you at the Eucharist table or in the bedroom. Like,
let's dance around the Eucharistic table. That's the way to do Eucharistic formation, I would say. Let's bring gay dance club culture into our churches around a shared table of bread and wine so that we could start doing this work seriously. You know, Tripp, one of the things you just reminded me of too is this isn't a luxury to start to be thinking more carefully around embodiment and bodies and sexuality. This isn't because we want to get our lesbian and gay people into our churches. That's important, yes, of course. But no, this is a defining, deciding moment where what is at stake is dealing with white supremacy, a deeply misogynistic, patriarchal culture that is killing planetary ecosystems. These things are deeply interconnected because of bodies and embodiment and desire and relationship. And the gospel has something to say about that, as do the historical Christian traditions. And this is urgent. The planet is dying. We've got to get on this.
Yeah, and the other day when I was interviewing Sally McFay, and one of the questions that had been sent in was from someone who's much more conservative and interested, like, where do you begin with, like, thinking about feminist theology? And like, oh, I need to do this. How do I begin? I don't know. And her response was interesting in that very quickly she points out that the connection between any of the liberation movement's insights in the planet, and how, like, one of the failures of the early feminist movement was missing the different experience of different types of female embodiment.
Yes.
And so you have, like, the womanist movement and things like that. But also that underneath it, the oppressive assumptions that the church has inherited are held up to us in the mirror of the planet.
Yes.
And so, like, to me, like you said, maybe the gay, lesbian issue type thing isn't the best place to begin in your congregation. But there is a sense that the best place to begin is whichever mirror you can hold up to first.
Yes.
And so often around the questions of bodies, it's the one you look into each morning.
Yes,
And the
exactly.
freedom of the gospel is an affirmation of your embodiment. And having done, at a large church, you do a lot of marriages. So,
Yes.
a couple hundred a year. And if there are 3 of us rotating, you see a lot of them. And, when you do premarital counseling, help them talk about the family and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
And so you get to hear all sorts of things that you don't always hear in most conversations with your friends.
Right.
And there are like 3 very specific stories where marriages and relationships changed completely once they were allowed to enjoy the bodies in the relationship with the one they're most vulnerable and loving to. And I mean, I'm talking like that happens and it correlates to the time you're able to forgive your parents and move on from the shame you were trapped in from abuse, to like being able to stop doubting yourself and take the step of starting something new in your own life. One couple had been infertile for years and the doctors couldn't figure out why. And then after processing things and learning to enjoy their bodies with each other, they're on their 3rd kid, pregnant with 3rd kid now. Like there is so much that can be bottled up because of shame around your body.
Oh, huge numbers of things.
To find out that Jesus might just want you to get down and orgasm regularly with your partner as like that's the communion moment. If you're freaking out about that, then you need to go bang. That's the pastoral advice, is like if you're freaking out about having really good sex with your partner and this is uncomfortable, then you should figure that one out. Because it's amazing all the closed doors that are connected to that.
Oh, my goodness. That's so well said. Absolutely. These things are deeply connected to each other. And for many of the ancient Greeks, the term eros, and by the way, Anders Nygren and C.S. Lewis, whom I love, but whom I wish never wrote the book, The Four Loves. I wish he had never written that book because it has convinced generations of Christians that erotic desire is unchristian, that only agape is the appropriate form of speaking about Christian love. But for the ancient Greeks, those forms of love were not distinct and separate. In fact, for many of those ancient Greek schools of thought, eros, or erotic energy, was the fountainhead of all the other types of love. Why? Because eros, eroticism, is about this deep desire for encounter, intimacy, and union. And that can take many forms. It can take genital sexual encounter. It can be a deep friendship. It can be our relationship with the wider world of nature. But it's about encounter, intimacy, and union. And that this is very much part of God's plan for creation from the beginning. It's not evil.
Yeah, Whitehead talks about divine eros, and one of the parts that he highlights that's connected to that is that in the kind of evolution of sentient beings across our history, it's the ritualization in early kind of proto-humans, and that creates the context to divorce our emotionality in the biological sense from just meeting our needs to sheer excess and exuberance. Things that can happen now in language, in symphonies, and lovemaking.
Yes.
But the erotic love is the first love that emerges because it's the excess gift that sentient beings get from their embodiment.
I love it. Yes.
So it's like just because these other things are possible doesn't mean you neglect the other. And all the different types of love, you can transcend them and you can include them. That's why you can be hurt and forgive your partner in ways that you could never have imagined when you said yes to them. And like 30 years into it, you can still get dirtier than you ever could imagine when you were 16. Like, it's not like you can't have all of it in a relationship.
Right.
And the sacredness of it goes all the way down.
all the way down.
And down and back up. But, we don't need to say it too many times on a podcast. People might be driving. And,
yes, right.
So the last question, and this is not mine, but I was telling one of my friends we were going to talk, and he said, so if you're sitting there and you went to seminary and then you get stuck in a Jay Johnson class, but you really just wanted a stole and to be a little uppity minister that would have never thought about any of this, what's it like to have the opportunity to liberate the loins of some of the most the class of humans who keep that junk on lockdown more than most? I'm not saying everyone at GTU does, but like the part of our oppression of our bodies has to do with the erotic less images of our religious leaders. And,
yes, right.
And so what's it like to invite the ministers to realize the enjoyment of their bodies and their partners, and it changes, like just modeling that love and celebrating it is actually part of their vocation and not something to hide?
So a great question. So, a couple of things in response to that, because I think it's super important what you just asked, and for these reasons. I'm not an essentialist about most things, and where I come closest to being one is that I really think that human beings generally are kind of hardwired in some way for God stuff and for sex stuff. And I think once you start sort of plucking the God string, the sex string is going to vibrate too. Mm-hmm. Or if you start plucking the sex string, the God string is going to vibrate in some way. And that is super important to pay attention to those resonances between them. I think much of the areas of abuse, clergy sex abuse, for example, but in other areas too, in our rape culture, in all sorts of ways, that those many areas, problematic areas, have to do with not paying attention to how these strings are resonant with one another, the God string and the sex string. Here's what's so fascinating and also sad, Tripp, is that this hardly ever gets talked about in seminaries, right? And so I've had close experiences with 3 seminary communities in my life. It's been true in every single one of those, and I bet it's true for every seminary everywhere, that there is a much higher rate of people in seminaries who remember childhood sexual abuse, or who fall in love, or who get married, or who get divorced, or who come out as LGBT or Q in some fashion. In other words, when you start plunging deeply into God stuff, as you do in seminary, all sorts of sex stuff starts coming to the fore as well. And this needs to be talked about in much better ways, sometimes at all, because then these people graduate and they get ordained and they start doing God stuff from a pulpit or behind an altar. And they're plucking God strings for everybody who's sitting in the pews. And if they're not dealing and talking directly with how this is also vibrating with all the sex and erotic stuff, that's a recipe for perpetuating bodily shame, potentially, or it's a recipe for creating the conditions for sexual abuse. Or here's the other thing that gets very dicey and challenging. It becomes occasions for re-triggering sexual trauma for people. You can guarantee that every faith community is going to have a certain percentage of people who bring with them a history of sexual abuse or trauma. And so in a place where you're dealing with God stuff and potentially sex stuff, to be really well aware of that is hugely important. And yet I think most seminaries do not prepare ordained leaders to do that. So that's a long response to your question. For me, I feel like in the classes that I get to teach here at PSR and the GTU, I am profoundly privileged to tread on very holy, sacred ground, because it has to do with our erotic desire for each other, which is about God. And that is an amazing privilege and responsibility.
And I think it's important for people to, I like the image of the strings resonating between sex and the holy, because I was a student minister and campus minister or youth minister for a long time. And after 10 years, I got to start mentoring younger ones who all had lots of shame that because they're 4 years older than someone who's 17 or 18 and they find them attractive, they think they're now like the most immoral thing of all time. And they are scared to say it because parents, right, and leaders of the congregation, it's just, they can't think about it at all. It just can't be on the table because they're still shamed around their own embodiment.
Exactly.
And you end up with having leaders who are unaware that successful religious leadership will mean you have to be responsible for the other side of stuff that's being activated at things. And if you aren't aware of it, then that's how you get in really difficult and awkward situations that people end up regretting because you've never dealt with the stuff that comes up.
Exactly. No, not only are most Christian faith communities not actively engaged in trying to heal bodily shame for their members, they are also often perpetuating the bodily shame that people bring because they're not addressing these issues around eros, around desire, and so on. And what I'm so convinced about, Tripp, is that bodily shame, it can go one of two directions. It can send one, as we mentioned this earlier, but it can send one deeply into an internal spiral, into isolation and alienation and self-hatred. Or it can be turned outwards toward others in aggression and hostility and violence. And Christian faith communities not only have an opportunity, but a responsibility to start addressing these things more deliberately, intentionally for this. I know this sounds like melodramatic, but I think it's true for the healing of our planet. Right?
Yeah. And it starts so early. That's what people don't get. Like, if your youth group runs on weird rules around what you wear and who can sit next to who and all that kind of stuff, don't think that's the only thing a teenager's hearing, because it's not. They're hearing all sorts of stuff. If you are with a group of people who want to know whether or not you can have physical encounters with your peers that are not sexually charged,
yes,
and you can't do that, like at your youth group, the place that then you're failing as a youth ministry. Like, coming up with weird rules about hugging and the length of shorts isn't helping anything. It's not. Like, that should be the place where you know you can get hugs and it's not going to get awkward because everyone hugs each other. Or you can play games and physical touch is involved and you're not just policing erotic desires all the time, or play games and you're not centering them on competition and defeat, but just the joy and enjoyment.
Yes.
There's, like, our bodies are taught things, even in progressive churches, in their student ministries, that end up telling them different theologies than their enlightened ministers trained in queer theology by Jay Johnson.
Right. And part of what you just, a colleague of mine some years ago put it so nicely when he said, the way that I was brought up, I was taught that sex is a dirty, nasty, dangerous thing. Save it for someone you love. So you talk about, that's a ridiculously mixed message, right? Like, this is this awful, terrible thing. You should only do it with people that you really love and care about, right? That is ridiculous. And still in progressive communities, we start with the dangers and the risks and the don'ts and all that sort of stuff. And I realize that we need to have parameters and rules and so on. But let's start by saying we are physical, embodied creatures who need touch to live and thrive, and intimacy is what we're made for. Now let's do our intimacy with one another that makes everyone feel safe and good. Let's frame it that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's why you should have more dance parties. So
yes.
Thank you so much. We talked way longer than I normally do for interviews, and that's because I was having too much fun.
This was great.
Anticipating people being energized for you coming back on, probably with a stack of questions they send in.
I would love it.
And so thank you so much for taking the time. And say again where people can connect with you on the internet if they're interested in.
Oh, yeah. Sure. And Trip, by the way, thank you for your really great and insightful questions. This has been a delight for me to talk with you as well. You can, I actually maintain a blog, I should say sort of irregularly, but it's there. Peculiarfaith.com is the name of my blog. You can also email me at Pacific School of Religion. I'm happy to receive your emails. You can find me on Twitter, and Facebook and Instagram. So just look for J. Emerson Johnson. And you can also find me at the GTU and PSR websites. Happy to be in touch with folks.
Awesome. Well, I will be looking forward to the next time we get to hang out and eagerly anticipating the next time you're around for a live podcast, because I feel like I should just have to battle you in au contraire, because you did so well. I feel like I might have real competition with you. Normally it has to have, I have to do it. If I'm in a play, it has to be a friend who will recognize just how nerdy, competitive, and for the joke I will go. But I don't have to worry about that with you. I know you can go there. So
this has been great fun, Trip, and I look forward to our next connection. Thanks.
All right.
This podcast is sponsored by Phillips Seminary in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a theological school that offers Christian education in service of intelligent, just, and compassionate religious and civic communities. They welcome students to a safe space for truth-seeking conversation about the Bible, Jesus, and faithful living. They have on-campus and distance learning options. Go check them out at www.wherefaithleads.com.